Grit your teeth and bear it. You get what you get and you don't get upset. These sayings are often presented to us as virtues. Be pious, be humble, endure suffering, and don't complain about it. Grit your teeth and bear it. But what happens when your suffering isn't caused by personal failure? What happens when you've done everything society asked of you and still end up with nothing? In The Jungle, Upton Sinclair explores that question through the life of Jurgis Rudkis. The first 20 chapters are basically a never-ending horror movie about poverty in Chicago stockyards around the turn of the 20th century. By the time we reach chapters 22 and 23, Sinclair isn't really showing us new forms of suffering anymore. Instead, he's showing us what all of that suffering has taught Jurgis. Through Jurgis's grief, his homelessness, labor conditions, and encounters with religion and charity, Sinclair argues that capitalist society blames poor and working class people for a suffering that society itself is actively creating. Before Sinclair turns back to labor relations, he reminds us that Jurgis is simply a human being trying to survive in America. In chapter 22, Jurgis gets caught in the rain and he seeks shelter in a small house where a Russian family lives. He shares a meal with them and talks about America with the father. Then he notices a baby being washed in a bath. The sight catches him completely off guard because it reminds him of his dead son. And he sees a vision of his wife and his child reaching out toward him. And he's forced to confront the fact that they're gone and he still has nothing. And he's overcome with grief, and he ends up running back out into the rain, and he spends the rest of the night sobbing. The scene is important to me because it demonstrates that poverty is not just economic deprivation. It destroys families. Ona and baby Antanas, Jurgis's wife and child, definitely would have survived the book had all of their material needs have been met. Unfortunately, they weren't. Poverty destroys families, it destroys relationships, and in any sense, it destroys emotional stability. By this point in the novel, we've watched nearly everything in Jurgis's life fall apart. Ona dies after being exploited by her employer. Jurgis is injured at his job. The children who they live with are forced to go into labor, and eventually Jurgis's son dies as well. And at that point, that's when he kind of says, fuck this. And he gets out of Chicago and he starts doing some eat, pray, love situation in the countryside. He's working seasonal jobs and spending most of his money on booze and gambling because he has nothing left. But for some reason, the man decides to return to Chicago in spite of all of the horrors he has experienced. And he gets a job working on this construction project, setting up electricity and tunnels underneath the city. Jurgis is working alongside union men who he learns are fighting an uphill battle against the large electric company CEOs, and managers are there who are just trying to bust the unions any way they can. In quotes, in the city, there was a combination of employers representing hundreds of millions of capital and formed for the purpose of crushing the labor unions. The chief union, which troubled it, was the Teamsters. And when these freight tunnels were completed, connecting all the big factories and stores with the railroad depots, they would have the Teamsters Union by the throat. This tunnel project is monumental. These are workers who are risking their lives to modernize Chicago with electricity. And how are they treated in return? They work in the tunnels where they can't breathe fresh air. Some of the men are dying or they're getting injured on the job. In fact, Jurgis himself gets another injury, a foot injury, while he's working in the tunnels, and because he's injured, he gets axed. Jurgis does another soul-destroying round of job hunting, and even when he finds work, the work is always dangerous, and he is always treated as disposable. This leaves Jurgis in a very vulnerable place. He has nowhere to live. He spends much of his time in bars so he can be somewhere warm with light. He continues to gamble and drink, and this is partly because the bars are one of the few places where they allowed him to sit in there and stay warm. There's an interesting moment in this homelessness arc where Jurgis seeks shelter in a church, and the church was functioning as a homeless shelter, but only so long as the unhoused listened to the sermon on suffering. And Jurgis, having done his fair share of suffering, thinks the sermon is bullshit. In quotes, what did he know about sin and suffering? With his smooth black coat and his neatly starched collar, his body warm and his belly full, and money in his pocket, and lecturing men who are struggling for their lives, men at the death grapple with the demon powers of hunger and cold. This, of course, was unfair. But Jurgis felt that these men were out of touch with the life they discussed, that they were unfitted to solve its problems. Nay, they themselves were part of the problem. They were part of the order established that was crushing men down and beating them. There's another quote. They were of the triumphant and insolent possessors. They had a hall and a fire and food and clothing and money, and so they might preach to hungry men, and the hungry men must be humble and listen. They were trying to save their souls, and who but a fool could fail to see that all that was the matter with their souls was that they had not been able to get a decent existence for their bodies, end quote. Jurgis isn't rejecting religion or morality. He rejects the preacher because the preacher's understanding of suffering is in this abstract area, whereas Jurgis' suffering is immediate and material. And Sinclair suggests that hunger and homelessness and poverty are material problems requiring fundamental social change, not empty words about how people suffer. When Jurgis is homeless, he spends a great deal of time begging for money and food. Often, people assume he's lying about what he'll spend the money on. So when he does finally collect enough money from people who sympathize with him, he returns to the bar where at least the public judgment is happening in a warm and dry place. In quotes, he would sally forth from a saloon, and after making sure there was no policeman in sight, would approach every likely-looking person who passed him, telling his woeful story and pleading for a nickel or a dime. Then, when he got one, he would dart around the corner and return to his base to get warm, and his victim, seeing him do this, would go away vowing that he would never give a cent to a beggar again. The victim never paused to ask where else Jurgis could have gone under the circumstances, where he, the victim, would have gone. At the saloon, Jurgis could not only get more food and better food than he could have bought in a restaurant, but a drink in the bargain to warm him up. Sinclair is forcing the reader to imagine what poverty is like from the perspective of the impoverished. He makes a very poignant observation on the way that Americans treat our homeless populations, very much holding a mirror to American society and showing that we aren't as good people as we might think we are. At first glance, The Jungle is a book about poverty in Chicago, but Sinclair's deeper argument is that we should hold a mirror up to ourselves and ask how we would treat someone who has lost everything. Someone who lost family, their child, their health, and their community. Would we care about another person suffering? We're often taught to bear our hardship as a badge of honor, turn the other cheek when injustice is done unto you, and that you have to accept the life the political and economic elite say you deserve. His suffering is not a result of laziness or poor character. He was strong. He was muscular. He was a strapping young man when he first arrived to America. And he turned into a shell of the man that he used to be. Job after job, loss after loss, humiliation after humiliation. This kind of suffering manifests in dangerous workplaces with employers who hold anti-union beliefs, inadequate social support, and there's demonization of being poor, and a society who's willing to judge the poor rather than understand them. Most of us are one paycheck away from not being able to pay our bills. And we're trapped in the grips of this never-ending cycle of not having enough time in the day to afford to live. More than a century after the publication of The Jungle, it still remains relevant because the scars on our nation's history of exploited labor, homelessness, and human dignity are still unresolved.